It was just another ordinary day in the city, cars honking, people rushing to work, the smell of coffee and street food hanging in the crisp morning air. Life was moving fast, as it always did here, and no one was really looking for anything out of the ordinary. But then, in the midst of all the urban chaos, something happened that no one could have expected. It began with a strange sound, faint at first, like the rhythmic clop of hooves against pavement. People paused, confused, trying to locate the source. And then, out of the shadows of a side street, it appeared a horse. This wasn't a police horse or one pulling a carriage for tourists. No, this was different. Its coat gleamed in the morning light, a deep, almost otherworldly shade of brown, and its eyes seemed to hold a weight that was impossible to ignore. It didn't look panicked or lost. If anything, it appeared purposeful, as though it had come into the heart of the city with a reason. At first, people reacted with confusion. A horse wandering the busy streets wasn't just rare, it was unheard of. Phones came out, cameras clicked, and social media began to buzz almost instantly. Is this some kind of publicity stunt? Someone muttered as they watched the animal navigate through the maze of traffic. Drivers honked, but the horse didn't flinch. It moved steadily, gracefully, like it had walked these streets before, though that couldn't possibly be true. A few brave souls approached, curiosity outweighing their caution. It didn't seem afraid of people, but neither did it seek their company. There was something in its gaze, an intelligence, a depth, that stopped people in their tracks. It looked at them but through them, as if searching for someone or something they couldn't see. The city's animal control was called, of course, but they didn't arrive immediately. The horse, meanwhile, continued its journey, weaving through intersections, stopping occasionally as if considering its next move. Some people followed at a distance, their interest piqued. What was it doing here? Where had it come from? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what was it looking for? A man in a suit, late for his meeting, paused to watch as the horse passed him by. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an urge to follow it. A child tugged on their mother's sleeve, insisting they stay to watch. Even the city's stray dogs, often skittish and quick to avoid humans, seemed to linger near the horse, tails wagging hesitantly. It was as if this lone animal had cast some unexplainable spell on the city, drawing everyone's attention and quieting the usual noise. Speculation began to grow. Some whispered that the horse had escaped from a farm or a ranch, though no one could point to one nearby. Others suggested it had come from the outskirts of the city, fleeing something we couldn't see. But those theories didn't seem to fit. This horse wasn't running. It wasn't lost. It had purpose. Determination. A woman standing on the corner felt a chill as the horse stopped and turned its head toward her. She swore it looked directly into her eyes, like it was trying to say something. But before she could react, it moved on. The moment lingered, though, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. By the time animal control finally arrived, the horse had disappeared into an alleyway. The crowd that had formed dispersed reluctantly, people returning to their lives but unable to shake the image of the horse from their minds. Social media posts were already circulating, with captions like, "The mysterious horse in the city, what does it mean? And is this an omen or just a strange coincidence?" As night fell, the city buzzed with speculation. The horse hadn't been seen since, but its presence lingered like a question left unanswered. Where had it gone? What had it been searching for? And why did it feel like this was just the beginning? In the hours after the horse vanished into the labyrinth of the city's alleys, the questions only grew louder. People couldn't stop talking about it. There were blurry videos on every platform, each one racking up thousands of views. Some showed the horse standing at the corner of a busy intersection, its head held high like it was surveying the crowd. Others captured it walking with an almost eerie calmness past startled bystanders. But none of them answered the one question everyone was asking: why? By the following morning, the horse had become a local phenomenon. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the same clips over and over, each trying to unravel the mystery. Experts were interviewed: veterinarians, animal behaviorists, even historians, but no one had any real answers. Horses don't just wander into cities like this, one expert explained, her tone baffled. It's not just unusual, it's almost impossible. But what struck everyone the most was the horse's demeanor. It wasn't frightened, and it wasn't wandering aimlessly. It had moved with purpose, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Meanwhile, in the heart of the city, the horse sightings began to resurface. A construction worker swore he saw it early that morning, standing silently near an unfinished high-rise. He described the same piercing eyes, the same unshakable stillness. But when he turned to call out to his crew, it was gone. Later that day, a bakery owner claimed she saw it through her shop's window, standing across the street. It stayed for a moment, then disappeared into the shadows before anyone else noticed. Each sighting was brief, fleeting, almost like a dream. But they all had one thing in common: the horse seemed to be looking for something. Or someone. Theories continued to spiral. Some said it was a ghost, a spirit from another time. Others thought it was a sign, though no one could agree on what it meant. There was even a rumor that the horse wasn't a horse at all, but something far stranger in disguise. Whatever the explanation, people began to feel it wasn't just an animal wandering the city. It was something more. Something they couldn't quite put into words. A young man who lived in a cramped apartment near the edge of downtown claimed he'd heard it late at night, the faint clop of hooves echoing down the empty streets. He stayed up for hours, staring out his window, waiting for it to appear, but it never did. Still, the sound haunted him, like a half-remembered song that lingered in the back of his mind. He wasn't alone. Others reported hearing the same sound in the quiet hours, always when the streets were nearly deserted. And each time, it felt like the horse was getting closer, as though it was narrowing in on its destination. But the more people talked, the stranger the details became. Some swore they felt a presence when the horse passed, an inexplicable feeling of being seen in a way they'd never experienced before. Others claimed they'd caught brief glimpses of it in places it shouldn't have been: on rooftops, in parking garages, even in the reflection of a shop window when there was nothing behind them. The stories grew more outlandish, but they all shared a common thread: the horse wasn't just moving through the city. It was weaving itself into their lives, leaving behind a sense of unease that was impossible to shake. One man, a cab driver who'd been working the night shift, told a chilling story. He'd been parked at the side of the road, waiting for his next fare, when he saw it in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by passing cars. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the horse came into focus, standing directly behind his cab. He turned around, but there was nothing there. When he looked back into the mirror, the horse was gone. He drove off immediately, heart pounding, and refused to work nights after that. As the sightings continued, a pattern began to emerge. The horse seemed drawn to certain places: abandoned buildings, forgotten alleyways, spots that carried an air of history or mystery. It was almost as if it was retracing old steps, following a path that only it could see. People started flocking to these locations, hoping to catch a glimpse of it, but the horse remained elusive. It appeared only when it chose to, and never for long. In one part of the city, an elderly woman claimed she'd seen it standing in a park that had been deserted for years. She described it with such vivid detail: the way its coat shimmered in the moonlight, the way its eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dark, that even the most skeptical listeners found themselves believing her. But what struck her the most, she said, was the way it seemed to linger, as if waiting for someone. She'd felt an overwhelming urge to approach it, to reach out, but something held her back. She couldn't explain it, but she was certain the horse was searching for something it had lost. Something it couldn't find on its own. The more the horse was seen, the more it began to feel like the city itself was changing. Streets that had always been bustling with activity seemed quieter, as if holding their breath. Shadows stretched longer, and the air carried a strange tension that no one could quite explain. People went about their routines, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something they couldn't prepare for. The horses' movements seemed random at first, but as people pieced together the sightings, a clearer picture began to form. It wasn't wandering aimlessly, it was following a path, one that zigzagged through the city in a way that defied logic. It visited places that seemed to have no connection, yet somehow, it felt like they were part of the same puzzle. A shuttered theater, a crumbling bridge, a quiet stretch of road where an old market used to stand. Each location held a story, a piece of history that most people had long forgotten. But the horse remembered. Or at least, it seemed to. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when the horse appeared in the heart of the city's busiest square. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Traffic came to a standstill, and people gathered around, watching in stunned silence as the horse stood there, perfectly still, as though waiting for something or someone to notice. Its eyes scanned the crowd, unblinking, and for a brief, electrifying moment, it felt as though time itself had paused. And then, just as quickly as it had arrived, it was gone, disappearing down a side street before anyone could react. But the moment left a mark. People couldn't stop talking about it, and the questions only grew louder. Who or what was this horse? And what could possibly be so important that it had drawn this creature into the heart of the city? The answers felt just out of reach, and yet, they were closer than anyone realized. The city was no stranger to mysteries. Over the years, it had seen its share of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena, but nothing had captivated people quite like this. The horse seemed to defy reason, moving like a phantom through streets and alleys, appearing and disappearing as though it were slipping between worlds. Yet, despite its ghostly nature, there was something undeniably real about it, something that rooted it firmly in the here and now. As more sightings were reported, the city seemed to split into two groups. There were those who were drawn to the mystery, following every lead, obsessively tracking the horse's movements, desperate to understand its purpose. And then there were those who wanted nothing to do with it, who felt an unshakable unease whenever they heard its name mentioned, as if they were better off not knowing what it was or why it had come. One man, a retired journalist who had spent decades chasing stories, found himself caught between those two worlds. He hadn't intended to get involved, but when he saw the horse with his own eyes, something shifted in him. It had been late at night, and he was walking home from a bar, the streets nearly empty. He turned a corner and there it was, standing under the flickering glow of a street lamp. For a moment, neither of them moved. The horse just stared at him, its gaze piercing, almost challenging. He felt as though it was trying to tell him something, but before he could take a step closer, it turned and vanished into the shadows. He couldn't explain why, but he felt as though he'd been marked somehow, chosen for a role he didn't fully understand. The man began digging into the city's history, trying to find anything that might explain the horse's strange behavior. His search led him to old archives, forgotten records, and stories that had long since faded from memory. What he found was a pattern, one that stretched back decades, even centuries. Stories of a lone horse appearing in times of upheaval or change, always in the same city, always with the same unshakable presence. But what tied these stories together wasn't clear. Some believed the horse was a protector, a guardian of something sacred. Others thought it was an omen, a warning of something terrible to come. The truth, if there was one, remained elusive. Meanwhile, others in the city were experiencing their own strange encounters. A woman who worked at a small bookstore swore she saw the horse standing in the alley behind her shop, its head lowered as though it were searching for something. When she stepped outside to get a closer look, it was gone, but the feeling lingered. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as though she'd interrupted something private, something she wasn't meant to see. That night, she dreamed of the horse, dreams so vivid they felt more like memories. In them, the horse was running through fields, its mane flowing in the wind, but there was a sadness in its eyes, a longing that pulled at her heart. In another part of the city, a young artist began incorporating the horse into his paintings. At first, he didn't even realize he was doing it. The images seemed to flow from him unconsciously, brushstrokes that formed the shape of a horse standing in places he'd never been, its eyes staring back at him from the canvas. His friends marveled at the work, calling it haunting and beautiful, but he felt uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that the horse wasn't just a subject, it was a message, one he didn't fully understand. As these individual stories unfolded, a larger picture began to take shape. The horse wasn't just moving through the city, it was connecting people, drawing them into its orbit in ways they couldn't explain. Some felt inspired, others unsettled, but all of them were changed in some way. And yet, the question remained, why? The journalist wasn't the only one searching for answers. A group of self-proclaimed investigators had formed, piecing together clues from social media posts, eyewitness accounts, and the city's history. They noticed patterns in the horse's movements, places it seemed to visit repeatedly. Some believed these locations held significance, that they were part of a larger puzzle. Others thought the horse was leading them somewhere, though no one could agree on where or why. But not everyone saw the horse as a mystery to be solved. For some, it was a threat. A city council member called for animal control to do their job and capture it, claiming it was a danger to public safety. Others whispered darker theories, suggesting the horse was tied to something sinister, something better left undisturbed. The tension in the city grew, and with it, so did the sense of urgency. Whatever the horse was searching for, it felt as though time was running out. One evening, the horse appeared in a place no one expected: the steps of an old, abandoned church. The building had been closed for years, its windows boarded up, its doors locked tight. Yet there it was, standing at the top of the steps, its head lowered as though in reverence. A small crowd gathered, watching in silence as the horse remained perfectly still. Some said they felt a strange energy in the air, a heaviness that pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. Others swore they heard whispers, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the horse was gone, leaving behind nothing but questions. In the days that followed, the church became a focal point for those searching for answers. People began leaving offerings on the steps: flowers, candles, even handwritten notes, though no one could say why. It was as though they felt compelled to do something, anything, to acknowledge the horse's presence. But the answers remained elusive, and the city's unease continued to grow. As the horse's appearances became more sporadic, the mystery only deepened. Some began to doubt their own memories, wondering if they'd really seen what they thought they had. Others grew more determined, convinced that the horse held the key to something important, something that could change everything. But what that was and whether they were ready to face it remained to be seen. The city was restless. It was as though the air itself had thickened, heavy with an unspoken tension. People whispered about the horse more than ever, its appearances now less frequent but increasingly unsettling. It seemed to emerge only at night, when the streets were quiet and the city felt like it was holding its breath. Each news sighting brought with it a strange mixture of awe and dread. The horse was no longer just a mystery, it was becoming something far more profound, something that defied explanation. One particularly cold night, a group of friends decided to follow a lead they'd pieced together from online sightings. They had mapped out the horse's movements, convinced there was a pattern. It always returned to certain locations, though the reasons were unclear. That night, they waited near an old railway yard, one of the horse's rumored stops. Hours passed, and the cold bit into their fingers and toes, but they stayed, driven by a curiosity they couldn't ignore. Just when they were about to give up, a faint sound broke the silence. Hooves on gravel, slow and deliberate. The group froze, their breath visible in the icy air, as the horse emerged from the shadows. It moved with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, its coat glistening under the dim light of a distant street lamp. None of them dared to move. They watched as the horse paused in the center of the yard, its head turning as though it were searching for something or someone. One of them, unable to resist, stepped forward, their voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" they asked, the words trembling as they left their lips. The horse turned its head toward them, its eyes locking onto theirs. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped. There was no sound, no movement, only the weight of that gaze. And then, without warning, the horse reared up, its front hooves striking the air before it bolted into the darkness. The group chased after it, but it was gone, leaving behind nothing but the sound of their own labored breathing. The encounter left them shaken, but they weren't the only ones. That same night, reports flooded social media of strange occurrences throughout the city. Some claimed to have seen the horse running through the streets, its movements eerily silent despite the pounding of its hooves. Others spoke of bizarre electrical disturbances, streetlights flickering, radios cutting out, phones losing signal. It was as though the horse's presence was disrupting the very fabric of the city. Among those deeply affected was the journalist, who had been tirelessly investigating the horse's origins. His research had taken him to places he never thought he'd revisit: abandoned archives, forgotten records, even the personal journals of people who'd lived in the city decades ago. The deeper he dug, the stranger the connections became. He found references to a similar horse appearing in the city during pivotal moments in its history, times of loss, upheaval, or transformation. But what stood out most were the descriptions. They were always the same: a lone horse with a shimmering coat and eyes that seemed to see through time itself. The journalist's obsession grew, consuming his every waking moment. He began to see the horse everywhere in his dreams, in the patterns of shadows on his walls, even in the faces of strangers on the street. It was as though the horse had become a part of him, its purpose entwined with his own. He knew he was close to something, but the closer he got, the more he felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss he couldn't fully comprehend. Elsewhere in the city, tensions were reaching a breaking point. The council member who had called for the horse's capture was now pushing for drastic measures. "It's causing chaos," they argued during a public meeting, their voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "People are scared. Businesses are suffering. We need to act before this gets out of hand." But others pushed back, insisting that the horse wasn't a threat, that it was trying to tell them something. The debate grew heated, dividing the city further. Some saw the horse as a harbinger of doom, while others believed it was a guide, leading them toward an unknown but necessary truth. As the city grappled with its collective unease, the horse made one of its most dramatic appearances yet. It was seen standing on the rooftop of a derelict building in the industrial district, silhouetted against the pale glow of the moon. How it had gotten there was anyone's guess, but the image was haunting. Dozens of people gathered below, drawn by an almost magnetic pull. They stared up in silence, their breath visible in the cold night air, as the horse stood motionless, its mane rippling in the wind. Some felt a sense of peace, others a profound sadness, but all of them were struck by the same thought: something was about to happen. The horse remained on the rooftop for what felt like an eternity before it suddenly bolted, leaping into the shadows and disappearing once more. But its presence lingered, leaving those who had witnessed it with a feeling they couldn't shake, a sense that they had been part of something far larger than themselves, something they couldn't yet understand. The next day, the journalists received an anonymous tip that would change everything. It was a simple message, delivered via an unmarked envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address scrawled on it, and a cryptic note: "This is where it began. This is where it will end." He felt a chill run down his spine as he read the words. The address was unfamiliar, located in a part of the city he rarely ventured to. But something about the note felt urgent, almost desperate. He knew he couldn't ignore it. That evening, as the city settled into its usual rhythm of lights and noise, the journalist made his way to the address. It was an old, crumbling building on the edge of the city, long abandoned and forgotten. The windows were shattered, the walls covered in graffiti, but there was a strange energy about the place, a hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door, before pushing it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Moonlight streamed through the broken windows, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. He called out, his voice echoing in the empty space, but there was no response. And then he heard it, the sound of hooves, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep within the building. His heart raced as he followed the sound, his footsteps crunching against the debris-strewn floor. The noise led him to a massive, open chamber at the center of the building. And there, standing in the moonlight, was the horse. It was more magnificent than he remembered, its coat shimmering with an almost ethereal light. Its eyes met his, and he felt a wave of emotion crash over him, grief, hope, fear, all at once. He took a step closer, his breath catching in his throat, as the horse stood perfectly still, as though waiting for him to make the next move. But before he could take another step, a sound from behind him made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and growing louder. He turned, his pulse quickening, as a shadow emerged from the darkness. Someone else was here, someone who had been waiting for him or perhaps for the horse. The tension in the room was unbearable, the air crackling with an energy that felt almost alive. The journalist glanced back at the horse, its gaze unwavering, and he realized in that moment that whatever was about to happen would change everything. The journalist's breath caught in his chest as the figure stepped into the faint light spilling through the broken windows. They were cloaked in shadow, their face obscured by the hood of a heavy coat. They moved slowly, deliberately, and stopped just a few feet away, their presence unsettling yet oddly familiar. The journalist felt an overwhelming urge to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. Something about the figure's silence felt more powerful than anything they could have said. Behind him, the horse shifted its weight, the sound of its hooves echoing softly in the cavernous space. The journalist glanced back at it, its shimmering form steady and calm, almost as if it were waiting. He turned back to the figure, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Finally, the figure raised their head slightly, enough for a sliver of light to reveal a part of their face. It was older, weathered, with a deep scar cutting across one cheek. But the eyes, that was what made the journalist's blood run cold. He knew those eyes. He had seen them before, staring back at him from a photograph buried deep in his research. "You've been looking for answers," the figure said, their voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than they cared to. "But you don't know right questions to ask." The journalist's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories and clues. He finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. "Who are you? And what is this?" He gestured vaguely toward the horse, which remained as still as a statue, its presence both comforting and unnerving. The figure chuckled softly, a sound that carried no humor. "That's not a question you should be asking," they said. "You should be asking why you're here. Why you've been chosen." The journalist took a step back, his heart pounding. "Chosen for what?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I don't even know what this is. The horse, the sightings, it doesn't make any sense." The figure tilted their head slightly, studying him. "You think this is about the horse?" they said, their tone almost pitying. "You're looking at the surface, but you're blind to what's underneath. This city, this place, it holds something most people can't see, something they're not supposed to see. But the horse, it knows. It's been trying to show you." The journalist's knees felt weak, but he steadied himself, unwilling to let his fears show. "Show me what?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "What is it trying to show me?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they reached into their coat and pulled out an object wrapped in a piece of faded cloth. Slowly, they unraveled it, revealing what looked like an ancient, weathered key. Its surface was etched with intricate patterns, symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. The journalist stared at it, a strange sense of recognition washing over him, though he couldn't explain why. "This," the figure said, holding the key out toward him, "is part of what the horse is looking for. But it's only one piece. There's more, scattered across the city, hidden in places most people would never think to look. The horse knows where they are, but it can't retrieve them on its own. That's why you're here." The journalist shook his head, overwhelmed. "Why me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm just a reporter. I don't have anything to do with this." The figure's expression softened, just slightly. "You've always been searching," they said. "Even before this. You've been drawn to stories, to truths buried beneath the surface. This isn't an accident. The horse didn't choose you at random." The journalist opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, a sudden sound cut through the air, a sharp, metallic clang, followed by the unmistakable echo of footsteps. Someone else was in the building. The figure's demeanor changed instantly, their body tense, their eyes scanning the shadows. They shoved the key into the journalist's hands, their voice urgent now. "You have to go," they said. "Take this and find the others. Whatever happens, don't stop. The horse will guide you." Before the journalist could respond, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps fading as quickly as they had come. The journalist stood frozen for a moment, the key heavy in his hands, his mind reeling. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, closer, and his instincts kicked in. Clutching key tightly, he turned and ran, the horse's steady gaze following him as he fled the building. Outside, the cold night air hit him like a shock. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone chasing him, but the street was empty. Still, he didn't stop running, his breath visible in the frosty air, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to put distance between himself and whatever or whoever was inside that building. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped in a secluded alley, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. His hands trembled as he unwrapped the key, its intricate patterns glinting faintly under the streetlight. The journalist's mind raced with questions, but one thought stood out above the rest. If this key was just one piece, how many more were out there? And what would happen when they were all found? As he stood there, trying to make sense of it all, a familiar sound reached his ears, the faint, deliberate clip-clop of hooves on pavement. He looked up, and there, at the end of the alley, was the horse. It stood motionless, its eyes fixed on him, its presence both comforting and unnerving. Slowly, it turned and began walking away, its steps echoing softly. The journalist hesitated for only a moment before following, the key clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't know where the horse was leading him, or what lay ahead, but one thing was certain, the stakes had never been higher. The city's secrets were unraveling, and he was caught in the center of it all, with no way to turn back. The journalist followed the horse through the winding streets, his steps quickening as a sense of urgency took hold. The city was eerily quiet, the usual hum of nightlife replaced by an oppressive stillness. He felt as though the world had folded in on itself, leaving only him, the horse, and the growing weight of what he carried. The key in his pocket seemed to pulse with a faint energy, as if it were alive, urging him forward. The horse led him to an unfamiliar part of the city, a forgotten neighborhood where time seemed to have stopped. The buildings were crumbling, their facades covered in vines and graffiti. Streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced with each step he took. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though when he glanced over his shoulder, the streets were empty. At last, the horse stopped in front of a massive iron gate, rusted with age and partially obscured by overgrown bushes. Beyond it stood a towering structure, its silhouette looming against the faint glow of the night sky. It looked like an old cathedral, though its spires were twisted and jagged, as if the building itself had been warped by time. The horse pawed at the ground, its breath visible in the cold air, before stepping aside. It was clear that this was as far as it would go. The journalist hesitated, his hand brushing against the key in his pocket. He knew this was the moment everything had been leading to, but fear gripped him. What if the answers he found were too much to bear? What if he wasn't ready? The horse let out a low, soft sound, almost like encouragement, and he took a deep breath before pushing open the gate. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty streets. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The cathedral was even more imposing up close, its stone walls covered in strange, intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change when he looked at them too long. The massive wooden doors were slightly ajar, and with one last glance at the horse still watching him from beyond the gate, he stepped inside. The interior was vast and cavernous, the ceiling disappearing into darkness. Moonlight streamed through shattered stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns on the floor. The journalist's footsteps echoed loudly as he moved forward, drawn to a faint glow at the far end of the room. There, in the center of what had once been the altar, was a pedestal. On it rested a circular object similar in design to the key he carried. It was another piece of whatever puzzle he had been pulled into. As he approached, the glow intensified, and the key in his pocket began to vibrate. He pulled it out, its pattern shimmering as if reacting to the object before him. The pieces fit together perfectly, and as he placed the key into the center of the circular object, a low, resonant hum filled the room. The carvings on the walls seemed to come alive, glowing faintly as an ancient mechanism began to move. The ground beneath him trembled, and a section of the floor slid open, revealing a hidden staircase spiraling downward into darkness. He hesitated, but the pull was too strong to ignore. Descending the stairs, he found himself in a vast underground chamber, unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were covered in more of the shifting carvings, and in the center of the room stood a massive, intricately designed structure. It looked like a machine, though its purpose was unclear. Surrounding it were more pieces like the key he had found, each glowing faintly, as though waiting to be activated. Before he could make sense of what he was seeing, a voice echoed through the chamber. "You've done well to come this far." He spun around to see the figure from the abandoned building, stepping out of the shadows. But they were different now, taller, more imposing, their eyes glowing faintly with the same light as the carvings. "You were never just a journalist," the figure continued. "You were always meant to find this." "What is this?" the journalist demanded, his voice trembling. "What does it all mean?" The figure smiled, though it was far from comforting. "This is the city's heart," they said. "A source of power and knowledge far beyond human comprehension. The horse has been its guardian, searching for those worthy to carry its secrets forward. You were chosen because you are capable of seeing the truth." The journalist shook his head, overwhelmed. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "I don't want any of it." "None of us do," the figure replied, their tone softening. "But it's not about what you want. It's about what the city needs." Before he could respond, the machine in the center of the room roared to life. The glowing pieces began to align, and the carvings on the walls pulsed with light. The air was filled with a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying, a symphony of something ancient and otherworldly. The journalist felt a surge of energy course through him, as though the room itself was alive and reaching out to him. But then, just as suddenly, the light flickered and dimmed. The machine let out a grinding sound, and the energy in the room shifted. The figure's expression changed, their calm demeanor replaced by alarm. "Something's wrong," they said, their voice sharp. "It's incomplete. There's another piece, one that's been hidden. The journalist's heart sank. Where? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure looked at him, their glowing eyes filled with urgency. The horse knows, they said. You have to find it, or everything we've done will be for nothing. Before he could respond, the chamber began to shake violently. The walls cracked, and pieces of the ceiling started to fall. The figure pushed him toward the stairs, their voice cutting through the chaos. Go! The horse will guide you. He ran, the ground shaking beneath his feet as the chamber began to collapse. When he reached the surface, the horse was waiting, its eyes filled with an intensity he hadn't seen before. Without hesitation, it turned and began to run, and he followed, the city blurring around him as they moved. They ran for what felt like hours, the horse leading him through streets and alleys that seemed to twist and shift in ways that defied logic. Finally, they stopped in front of a small, unassuming building, a library, long abandoned and forgotten. The horse pawed at the ground, urging him forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the shelves were lined with books that hadn't been touched in decades. But in the center of the room was a single pedestal, and on it rested the final piece. It was smaller than he expected, almost ordinary, but as he picked it up, he felt the same surge of energy as before. The horse let out a soft sound, its eyes meeting his as if to say, "This is it." He didn't have time to think. He ran back to the cathedral, the horse at his side, the city around them eerily silent. When they reached the underground chamber, the figure was waiting, their expression a mixture of relief and urgency. You found it, they said. Now finish it. With trembling hands, he placed the final piece into the machine. The room filled with light, brighter than anything he had ever seen, and for a moment, he felt as though he was part of something infinite. The machine roared to life, its energy filling the air, and the city above seemed to breathe as though it had been holding itself in for centuries. But then came the twist. As the light faded, the journalist looked at the figure, expecting answers, clarity, something. Instead, the figure smiled a sad, knowing smile. The city's heart is restored, they said. But its guardian must remain. Before he could ask what they meant, the horse stepped forward, its shimmering form growing fainter. It looked at him one last time, its eyes filled with a depth of emotion that nearly brought him to his knees. And then, in a burst of light, it was gone. The journalist stood there, the weight of what had happened settling over him. The city was quiet now, its tension eased, but he knew it would never be the same. Neither would he. The journalist stood in the vast, empty chamber, the final echoes of the machine's roar fading into silence. The glow of the carvings on the walls dimmed until they disappeared entirely, leaving only the faint, flickering light from the broken cathedral above. It was over, or at least, it seemed to be. The horse, his constant companion through this surreal journey, was gone. He felt an ache deep in his chest, a strange sense of loss for a creature he had only just begun to understand. He looked down at his hands, still trembling from the energy he had felt coursing through him just moments before. The final piece of the machine now lay dormant, its faint shimmer replaced by a dull, lifeless surface. He reached out to touch it, but the figure, the one who had guided him this far, shook their head, stopping him. They looked different now, more human than before. The glow in their eyes was gone, and their presence felt smaller, quieter, as if they too had given something up in the process. You've done what needed to be done, the figure said, their voice soft and tired. The city's heart is whole again. Its balance has been restored. The journalist frowned, his mind still racing with unanswered questions. But what does that mean? He asked. What balance? What was the point of all this? The figure sighed, their gaze drifting to the machine. This city is alive in ways most people will never understand, they said. It breathes, it grows, it remembers. But it also carries pain, secrets, and scars. The heart was its anchor, its way of holding itself together. Without it, the city was falling apart, its pieces scattering into chaos. The horse. It was a part of that heart, a guardian meant to keep it safe. But even it couldn't do it alone. The journalist swallowed hard, the weight of their words sinking in. So, the horse sacrificed itself to fix the heart? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, struggling to process it all. I didn't ask for this, he said. I was just chasing a story. I didn't want to. I didn't mean to. His voice trailed off, the enormity of what had happened leaving him speechless. The figure stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. No one ever asks for it, they said. But sometimes, we're chosen because we're capable, because we can bear the weight when others can't. You've done more than you'll ever realize. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the journalist's thoughts spinning in endless circles. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steadier, though still laced with uncertainty. What happens now? He asked. To the city? To me? The figure offered a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach their eyes. The city will heal, they said. Slowly, quietly, in ways no one will notice. And you? You'll go on. You'll carry this with you, even if no one else understands. But that's how it's always been, hasn't it? You've always sought the hidden truths, the stories that others overlook. Now you've become a part of one. The figure stepped back, their form beginning to fade, like a shadow melting into the darkness. The city will remember you, they said. And so will I. And then they were gone, leaving the journalist alone in the chamber. The air felt heavy, almost sacred, as if the room itself was holding its breath. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and began the long climb back to the surface. When he emerged into the cold night air, the city felt different. It was quieter, calmer, as though the tension that had gripped it for so long had finally eased. The streets were still empty, but they no longer felt oppressive. Instead, there was a sense of peace, of something settling into place. He walked slowly, his steps carrying him back through the city's winding streets. He didn't know where he was going, but the pull that had guided him before was gone, leaving him to navigate on his own. As he passed the places he had visited during his journey, the abandoned building, the forgotten library, the cathedral, he felt a strange sense of connection, as though the city itself was acknowledging him, thanking him in its own quiet way. Eventually, he found himself back at his apartment, the familiar surroundings grounding him in reality. He sat down at his desk, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The key, now just a lifeless object, sat on the desk before him. He stared at it, wondering if he should write about what had happened, if anyone would even believe him. But as he reached for his notebook, he hesitated. Some stories, he realized, weren't meant to be told. They were meant to be lived, to be carried quietly by those who experienced them. He put the key in a drawer, closing it gently, and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the city hummed softly, its lights twinkling like stars. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of calm, of things being as they should be. The horse was gone, but its presence lingered, a quiet reminder of journey he had taken and the part he had played in something far greater than himself. As he sat there, the night stretching on, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The city was alive, and so was he. And though he didn't know what the future held, he knew he would face it with open eyes, ready to see the truths that others overlooked. The horse had shown him the way, and now it was up to him to keep moving forward. And so he did, one step at a time, carrying the story with him, even if he never spoke of it again.